I imagine most of you have a place in your home that is a place you consider more comfortable than others. And maybe it's the most comfortable spot. And you're probably going to the couch or the bed or the recliner. Those are probably the places when I talk about comfort, places that you can just really take a load off and relax. But there are some concepts. Maybe it's the kitchen. Maybe it's the garage. Maybe it's the basement. Maybe it's some other type of place that you can just de-stress and get away. So it's not just the physical comfort of sitting down or laying down, but it's of getting away. We live in a society that, in a lot of levels, the main goal is to make life as comfortable as possible. I mean, when we face hardships or difficulties or things that aren't exactly what we would like them to be, we try to figure out how we can change it. We want to get rid of these things that are difficult. I mean, that's kind of what our society has moved to. But a lot of times this has a selfish connotation to it. That we live selfishly in a way that's contrary to the righteousness and the standard that God calls us to live. Now, I'm not saying we need to go around looking to try to make our lives more difficult. There are plenty of things out there that make your life difficult. We don't need to go looking for them. They naturally find us, right? But we have to recognize that comfort is not the main goal. If my main goal was to spend the years I have on this life comfortable and convenient and as luxurious as I can make them, then I'm too focused on the present, and I've missed what Jesus has called us to do. There's something greater. Not as though the present doesn't matter, but as though there's something greater. We have a greater purpose than just to be comfortable. And when we think about Jesus and the life that He's called us to live, the righteousness that we're called to live by, the standard that He has given us, we recognize that a lot of times that means we have to go against the grain of culture. We have to do something contrary to what the culture says. This is what you should do. So Jesus calls us to take a stand. He calls us not to allow the things of this world to consume us. But the thing about taking a stand is you can't do it sitting down. You can't do it from your lazy boy. Now again, I'm combining the literal and figurative here in the sense of you can sit down and take a stand for Jesus. Otherwise, I would have you stand during the sermon. Right? Which would not be comfortable for anybody. But too many times, I think we take a back seat. We say, you know what? I'm just not going to put forth the effort. This is about making a conscious decision to stand up for Jesus in our world today. You can't take a stand by sitting down. And so we come back to David's mighty men. Last week we looked at two of his top three mighty men, Adino and Shammah. And today we're going to continue in 2 Samuel 23, starting in verse 9, with the next guy in rank, Eleazar. He was the son of Dodai and a descendant of Ahoah. Now, as we look at this, it's really easy to skip past that mention, all right? We've got the name of the guy, Eleazar, his dad, and some descendant of his. So why would that be worth mentioning? Well, Ahoah was the son of Bela, who was the son of Benjamin. And if you remember, Israel, the nation of Israel, was split up into 12 tribes. And the 12 tribes were essentially, for the most part, the 12 sons of Jacob. Benjamin was one of Jacob's sons, so Benjamin was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we see that Eleazar is part of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, when Israel first entered the Promised Land, they didn't have a king. They didn't have a monarchy like they did at this point in time. Eventually, they convinced God or pleaded with God enough that God gave them a king. And He raised up this guy named Saul and anointed him as king. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul's leadership started off great, and he united the 12 tribes of Israel, and things were going well, but as he continued to progress in his leadership, he fell further and further away from God, eventually doing his own thing. So God rejected him as king. Now, even though he was the first king in Israel, they expected that the second king of Israel would be one of his sons. That's kind of the natural progression in the ancient world. Well, God rejected Saul and his household as the monarch and anointed David and his household as the new monarchy of Israel. And David was from the tribe of Judah. And there was a lot of clashing going on between the house of Saul and the house of David, which essentially means the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah didn't get along real well. Now, David eventually rose up and was able to defeat Saul and establish his reign and become the most successful and greatest king of Israel. But Eleazar, remember, was from the tribe of Benjamin, and there was continual animosity and tension between these two tribes. But even though Eleazar was from a tribe that supported somebody else as king, he was committed to David. So maybe we ask why. Why would he do that? Now, maybe he saw the poor choices that Saul was making and said, God doesn't honor Saul, so I need to follow someone who is following God. But on top of that, we have his father, Dodai. Now, Dodai was a pretty impressive individual. Doesn't get much mention in the Old Testament, but they had a rotational system with their military during these days. And 1 month of the year, Dodai was the commander of a division of Israel's army. And a division had 24,000 troops. So he was the leader of 24,000 troops, and they rotated 1 month every year. But the fact that he led so many troops kind of shows he was a big deal. He had a lot of leadership, a lot of ability and credibility to be able to control and maintain and lead that size of a group. But again, he was from the tribe of Benjamin. So he would have at least been a high-ranking official or a rising official during the reign of King Saul. Then, during the reign of King David, he became a commander of an entire division. So we see again how the house of Saul and the house of David, of how is this working together? Because Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, supported Saul. So why did Dodai choose to be faithful to David? Why did he choose to follow him? Now, being either a rising in rank or a high-ranking official, he probably would have been well informed about what was going on with Saul and the choices he was making. Because if you read about his life, you see time after time he makes choices that really aren't good. And he goes off the deep end in a lot of ways. So Dodai would have recognized this guy is not being true to who our God is. And he would have imparted that on Eleazar. But then we do have the question of, was there some nepotism involved here? If Dodai was such a high-ranking individual, did Eleazar get a leg up on everybody because of that? Well, on some levels, Eleazar probably received some extra training and opportunities that others may not have. But in order to be a mighty man of David, a warrior, you had to prove yourself. For those of you who've been in the military, there may be some people who have gotten other opportunities, but when push comes to shove, you've got to prove yourself, right? The military is going to recognize if you can't cut it, you're just going to get cut. They're not going to make exceptions for you. So when we talk about someone who's a mighty warrior, if he wasn't worth it, he wouldn't have been listed here. And so we come to the story that it mentions here in 2 Samuel chapter 23, because once Eleazar and David stood together against the Philistines, when the entire Israelite army had fled. He fought the Philistines until his hand froze to the sword and he could no longer lift it. And the Lord gave him a great victory that day. The rest of the army did not return until it was time to collect the plunder. That's some pretty interesting imagery. First off, I love the fact that you see that it's specifically mentioned that Eleazar and David are standing together. So we see very intentionally that Eleazar from the tribe of Benjamin put aside his personal political difference to follow the Lord's anointed, the one that God said, this is the leader, and he stood toe-to-toe next to him and said, we're going to fight together. because you are the Lord's anointed. I'm going to follow you. I think too many times we allow pride to get into our lives. You know what? We got some differences. I'll stand close to you. I'll be in the vicinity, but I'm not going to be shoulder to shoulder and battle with you just because I don't care to make forth that effort. See, you only fight for things that you're passionate about. If Eleazar was not passionate about following David, he wouldn't have stood next to him against the Philistines. He would have left with the rest of the Israelite army. There was an opportunity for him to leave, and no one would have questioned him. But he said, I'm going to stay with my leader, who is the Lord's anointed. And he shows us you can't take a stand sitting down. You can't take a stand running away. You've got to stay there. Because Israel retreated. Now, for generations, the Philistines tormented Israel. They were a thorn in their side time and time again. And it was frustrating, it was difficult, and caused a lot of hardship for Israel. Now, you may not be super familiar with the Philistines, but you're probably familiar with at least one. Goliath is probably the most famous Philistine. We know the story of David versus Goliath, about the young boy versus the mighty giant warrior, and we love to root for the underdogs when we're trying to make the analogy today. But Goliath epitomizes the Philistines. They were fierce warriors. They were ruthless. They were a force to be reckoned with. But we have to remember, Israel was a trained fighting machine. These weren't scrubs. These weren't just a group of people who got together and said we should do something. They were trained. See, Israel entered the promised land, Palestine, established their kingdom by driving out the other nations, by going to war against them. So it's not as though these were scared individuals. These were well-trained fighting machine. But when we see a group like Israel's army who was well-trained, who was a fighting machine, when we see that they run before the battle even starts, it shows us how fierce the enemy is. So make sure we hold all of these things in perspective when we think of David and Eleazar standing against the Philistines when everybody else is running. This well-oiled fighting machine of Israel ran away, but these two guys stayed. But I've wondered a little bit, though, why did Eleazar stay? Did he just miss the memo that they were retreating? And he was like, uh-oh, now what do I do? Because that's not a very good situation to be in. But regardless of what happened or why it happened, we see that he did not retreat. And then you ask the question, was he crazy or was he brave? When you think of the entire Philistine army coming at them after all of his comrades had left, and he stands there with David, was that a wise decision? But then it makes me think about following Jesus. Jesus was very clear that there's a cost to follow him. In fact, there are several times when Jesus shares the cost and people leave because they say it's not worth it. Now, when we're talking cost, we're not talking about just throwing a few dollars in the offering plate or volunteering once a month or something like that. We're talking about life-transforming decisions. That if we want to be a follower of Jesus, it's not for the casual person. It's for the person who is willing to commit everything they have towards who Jesus is. So when I think about Eleazar, was he crazy or was he courageous? I think you need a little crazy to follow Jesus. We think about, we talk about following Jesus, we need to live counterculturally. The world says these are the things you should do, these are the things you should aspire to achieve, and Jesus says, nah, that's not what it's all about. There's something greater, there's something different. So Jesus calls us to a different lifestyle. So the world looks at us and say, well, that's weird. Why would you do that? Why would you give of your time, your energy, your resources when you could be doing all these other things? Because Jesus is worth following. I hope that's our answer. I hope we get to the point where we recognize that even though it causes sacrifices, even though it means that we're going to miss out on other things that the world values, following Jesus is worth it. But with Eleazar, and the call that Jesus has for us is we can't take a stand sitting down. So we have to be crazy. We have to be courageous. But when we look at the world, and we look at those who say they're followers of Jesus, the sad reality is often there's not much difference between the two. We think of the different choices that those who follow Jesus and those who don't follow Jesus make. And someone who is looking from the outside can see those choices and say, I don't really see any difference. And there are many different just reasons, or there's many different surveys that show that those who are part of the church and those who aren't part of the church really don't have much difference in lifestyle choices. So what I would say is I think too many people are part of the Israelite army thinking that they're Eleazar, but they're really not. So you think of, let's just assume that this was a division of Israelites' army that was there. Let's just assume that. It doesn't say it. So that means that 23,999 people thought they were following David like they were supposed to, but they weren't. That's not a very good percentage. Now, I'm not saying the church has that necessarily same percentage, but there are a lot of people who think they're following Jesus like they're supposed to, but they're retreating in the face of the enemy. See, Eleazar knew what it meant to take risks. He was fighting this battle. He fought against the Philistines. And I love the imagery that his hand froze to the sword. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever experienced that type of thing where you've been doing some type of physical activity to the extent where like your hand was kind of stuck in place. Now, you could probably move it, and that's an extreme example, but maybe you've experienced something where the muscles feel a little weird after whatever that activity was. I get the impression that this was more than just a little weird. He was so exhausted, so fatigued, had used so much adrenaline in that moment that he could not let go of the sword. That the battle was that intense. And this type of phenomenon only happens when all those things come together. When the intensity and the necessity come together to require him to do something of that nature. But I also get to think that this was some muscle memory that was happening here. Now, he gripped the sword, and he was a soldier. He was a warrior, one of David's mighty men. So we see that he had been trained, and he continued to train. So his muscles were used to doing these types of things. But I also think there was some muscle memory involved in choosing to stand with David. Because too many times I think we forget that. We want all the skill set of the battle to be able to defeat the enemy, but we have forgotten that there's a skill set, there's a muscle memory, a discipline involved, and being willing to face the enemy. He stood. He didn't run away. He stood there next to David, the Lord's anointed, and stayed with him no matter what. He didn't flee in the face of adversity. He didn't flee when things got tough. It was a natural reaction of who he was. And I think we can get to that same point when we're talking about following Jesus. That we've spent so much time with Jesus, we've trained so much with him, that it's muscle memory to be faithful to him. Not in a robotic sense, but in a sense that say, I am committed to who Jesus is in every ounce of my body, so the natural reaction of who I am honors Jesus. We can get to that point, but too many times we're just quickly fleeing, going away. Because it was dangerous. It was hard. It was difficult. Now we know that we can't allow the odds to determine what we should or shouldn't do. The assurance of victory for Eleazar was not given beforehand. There was no assurance that he was going to survive. There was no assurance that this was going to be a good idea. But when we're talking about courageously following Jesus, we have to do it regardless of what the outcomes appear to be predicted to be. We have to follow him no matter what. Because our victories, our defeats, our success, our failures are viewed through the lens of eternity with who Jesus is. It's not viewed through the lens of what is my portfolio going to look like, or what are the awards I'm going to be recognized for, or what position will I achieve at work, or how popular will I be. If those are the things that determine our choices, then we've already lost the battle. We have the eternity with Jesus that we view our choices. But then we see that the rest of the Israelite army comes scampering back when it's time to collect the plunder. Man, I think that's just an indictment on who they are. Oh, hey, David and Eleazar did all the work. We're going to go enjoy the spoils of war, the spoils of victory. And I think there are a lot of people who are like that with Jesus. Hey, these people over there are going to do the work, but when it goes well, we're going to come back and cheer. Woo! But when it doesn't, we're going to be like, well, they shouldn't have done that in the first place. We're going to be all self-righteous about it, right? I mean, that's natural. That's a natural reaction that we have. But Eleazar said, I'm not going to flee. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to escape. The rest of the Israelite army couldn't discount Eleazar's success. They saw, and he took a stand. He meant business. He was successful. Man, what a guy. But they didn't have the courage to be Eleazar. They didn't have the courage to take a stand. They didn't have the courage to have confidence in who the Lord's anointed was. But years of dedication, years of training, years of conscious decisions by Eleazar prepared him for this moment. There's an old hymn in the church. I don't even know how old it is, but it's old to me. It's, I have decided to follow Jesus. And really very simple song. And I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. And we get really excited about that and we say, that's me. I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm not going to forsake him. I'm going to stay with him. But then we get, I think it's the third verse. It says, though none go with me, still I will follow. It's easy to sing that song. It's real hard to live that song. We live in a world that says taking a stand for Jesus, you could do that sometimes, but for the most part, it's not worth it. There's all these other opportunities, all these other things that you could be doing, and so Christians have been culturally assimilating to society. And we're becoming more and more like society and less like Jesus. And I say, church, it's time to take a stand. It's time to quit sitting down. And I'm not talking about going and storming City Hall or something like that. I'm talking about experiencing the life-transforming work of Jesus in your life personally. Because in order for us to take a stand, Jesus has got to mean something to you. He's got to radically change who you are. And if Jesus hasn't changed who you are, if he hasn't influenced you, if he hasn't made your life completely different, then you are more like the 23,999 Israelites that fled and less like Eleazar. You can't take a stand sitting down.